Perhaps we are living through one of the strangest periods in modern history. A time when the entire world can feel that something is changing. No one truly knows what will happen next. But almost everyone can sense that the current system no longer feels as stable as it once did. Wars are appearing across the world. Artificial intelligence is advancing faster than ever before. Nations are competing for chips, data, and energy. Global debt continues to rise beyond control. Trust in old systems is slowly beginning to crack. And in the middle of all this, modern people are living in a constant state of anxiety. Every day, we are flooded with endless information. Economic fear, war, market instability, technological disruption, and predictions about an uncertain future. But the most unsettling realization is this. Maybe this is no longer just another ordinary crisis. Maybe we are witnessing the transition of an entire civilization. Throughout history, every empire once believed it would last forever. Rome believed its power was eternal. The British Empire once ruled much of the world. Financial systems once considered unshakable eventually began to fracture. Because history has always moved in cycles. Every system has a beginning. And eventually, every system begins to show cracks. At first, very few people notice. Because most human beings are distracted by immediate problems. They focus on daily fluctuations. While history quietly changes direction behind them. That is exactly what is happening in the modern world. Many people still believe these are only isolated events. Temporary economic instability, a few regional conflicts, a difficult phase that will eventually pass. But if we look deeper, we begin to see that everything is connected. The war for technology, the war for data, the war for energy, the war for artificial intelligence, the war to control the future itself. Nations are no longer competing only with armies. They compete through semiconductors, through information, through satellites, through artificial intelligence, through the ability to control the flow of global energy. The old world is slowly losing the balance it maintained for decades. And whenever an old order begins to weaken, human beings usually respond with panic. History has repeated this pattern again and again. People fear change. They fear instability. They fear the feeling of losing control. But what is fascinating is that the most chaotic periods in history are often the moments when a new world quietly begins to emerge. When the Roman Empire weakened, a new era appeared. When old empires collapsed, the map of the world was rewritten. When financial systems changed, human civilization changed with them. And perhaps, that is the era we are entering right now. A time when technology evolves faster than human adaptation. A time when information moves faster than human thought. A time when millions of people are consumed by daily noise. Until they no longer have enough silence to see the larger picture. This is why so many modern people feel mentally exhausted. Not because they are weak, but because the human mind was never designed to live in a world moving this fast. And during periods like these, the rarest thing is no longer wealth. It is clarity. What makes this era even more unsettling is that this is not the first time humanity has entered a period like this. History has always repeated itself in different forms. Whenever an empire reaches the peak of its power, people begin believing the system will last forever. But over time, confidence slowly becomes dependence. Dependence becomes fragility. And eventually, cracks begin forming from within. That is what happened to Rome. That is what happened to many great empires throughout history. And perhaps, something similar is happening again in the modern world. For decades, the world operated under a relatively stable order. Nations depended on one another. Financial systems became deeply interconnected. Powerful currencies dominated global trade. Major powers maintained a balance that shaped the modern world. But now, that balance is beginning to shift. Countries that once cooperated are slowly turning against each other. Global supply chains are fragmenting. The technological race is becoming more aggressive than ever before. Semiconductors are now as important as oil once was. Artificial intelligence is becoming the greatest power race of the new era. Data has become a strategic resource. And for the first time in modern history, human beings are beginning to realize that the future of civilization itself may be shaped by algorithms. That is why every major power is rushing into the technology war. No nation wants to be left behind. Because whoever controls technology controls the economy. Whoever controls data controls perception. And whoever controls artificial intelligence may control the future. But while the world is changing at extraordinary speed, many people still live as if everything will remain the same forever. They believe the current system will always exist. They believe their jobs will always be secure. They believe society will continue functioning the way it always has. History shows that this is often humanity's greatest mistake. Because civilizations change faster than people expect. Especially near the end of a cycle. What once took centuries to transform can now happen within years. A new technology can destroy entire industries. A single conflict can destabilize the global economy. A financial crisis can reshape the balance of world power. And the most frightening part is this. Most people only realize history has changed after the transformation is already complete. That is why calmness becomes incredibly important during times like these. Because crowds always react emotionally. They panic when markets become unstable. They panic when wars appear. They panic when technology evolves too quickly. But the people who can see the larger picture understand that history has always moved in cycles. No empire lasts forever. No system remains untouched forever. No civilization stands still forever. The only thing human beings can truly do is learn to adapt before it is too late. Perhaps that is the real challenge of the modern age. Not who owns the most, but who can remain clear-minded. While the world changes faster than ever before, perhaps the most dangerous thing during great transitions in history is not war. It is not economic collapse either. It is the inability of human beings to adapt fast enough to change. When the world begins moving too quickly, many people cling desperately to what feels familiar. They want everything to return to the way it used to be. They want economies to feel stable again. They want jobs, societies, and daily life to operate the way they once did. But history never moves backward. Once a new era begins to emerge, everything changes permanently. That is what happened after the Industrial Revolutions. That is what happened when the Internet appeared. And perhaps artificial intelligence will create an even greater transformation than both. Many people still believe AI is simply another technological tool. But what they fail to realize is this. Every technology powerful enough eventually reshapes society itself. The Internet did not only change communication. It changed the way human beings think. The way people pay attention. The way people measure self-worth. And artificial intelligence may do the same thing. But on a much larger scale. For the first time in history, Humanity is creating systems capable of learning, reasoning, and replacing parts of human intelligence itself. This is no longer just a technological revolution. It is a civilizational revolution. That is why the greatest conflict of this era is not only economic or military. It is a battle over the future itself. The nation that leads artificial intelligence may shape global power for decades to come. That is why every major power is rushing into the technological race with extraordinary urgency. Because in this new world, power no longer comes only from oil or military strength. Power now comes from data, from algorithms, from the ability to control information and human perception. And while nations compete to shape the future, many ordinary people are slowly losing the ability to control their own minds. They live in a constant state of reaction. A headline appears, they panic. Markets fluctuate, they become afraid. Social media explodes with outrage, and they are instantly pulled into the chaos. Very few people still possess enough calmness to stop and ask, what is actually happening to the world? That is why clarity has become an extremely rare advantage in the modern age. Most people are trapped inside short-term noise. Until they completely lose sight of the larger picture. They focus on individual days. While history is written across decades, they focus on temporary emotions. While civilizations transform through cycles lasting centuries. This is exactly what many ancient philosophers tried to warn humanity about. Everything changes. All power is temporary. Every system eventually weakens. But during periods of chaos, human beings often forget the most important truth of all. If you cannot control your own mind, the world will control it for you. And perhaps that is the real battle of the modern age. Not the conflict between nations, but the struggle to keep yourself from being consumed by the chaos of the modern world. There is something most human beings do not want to accept. Many of the systems we once believed were permanent are actually held together by belief itself. Currencies operate on belief. Markets operate on belief. Empires operate on belief. And sometimes, entire civilizations operate on belief. For decades, people believed the modern world would only become more stable over time. Technology would solve every problem. Global economies would continue expanding. Nations would become increasingly cooperative. But history always finds a way to remind humanity that no system is immune to decline. Once trust begins to weaken, everything can change very quickly. That is why periods of historical transition often create deep psychological anxiety. People can feel that something is ending, but they do not yet understand what is beginning. This is the state many modern people now find themselves trapped inside. They see artificial intelligence advancing too quickly, global tensions rising between major powers, massive debt expanding across economies, markets becoming increasingly unstable, and technology reshaping human life every single year. And deep down, many people are beginning to feel that the future is no longer predictable. Perhaps for the first time in generations, modern society is truly beginning to sense how fragile its systems really are. Because the more deeply we study history, the more we realize that no era lasts forever. Cities once considered the center of the world eventually became ruins. Currencies that once dominated global trade eventually disappeared. Powers that once terrified entire civilizations slowly weakened with time. History does not stand still for anyone. And perhaps what frightens people most today is the feeling that the world is entering a new chapter without anyone truly understanding where it leads. That is why so many people have become obsessed with news and prediction. They are desperately searching for certainty. They want to know what happens next, what the economy will become, whether artificial intelligence will replace human beings, whether the world is moving toward an even greater crisis. But the truth is this: during major transitions in history, no one truly knows what the future will look like. Even the greatest empires once believed they could control everything, and history still changed beyond their expectations. That is why Stoic philosophers constantly repeated one central idea: human beings suffer most when they try to control what lies beyond their control. You cannot control the global economy. You cannot control wars. You cannot control how quickly technology evolves. But you can control how you respond to those things. That is the difference between people who are consumed by the world and people who remain calm inside the chaos. Because during the most unstable periods in history, the panic of the crowd often becomes more dangerous than the crisis itself. And perhaps, that is why clarity is becoming such a rare form of strength in the modern world. Perhaps this is why the deeper humanity moves into the modern age. The more disconnected people become from themselves. We live in the most connected era in human history. And yet, at the same time, it may also be the loneliest. Human beings can now know what is happening anywhere in the world within seconds. Yet many no longer understand what is happening inside their own minds. Every day, millions of people wake up and are immediately pulled into an endless stream of information. They read about wars, about artificial intelligence, about economic collapse, about markets, about predictions of the modern world falling apart. For most of history, the human mind was never forced to carry this kind of psychological pressure. In the past, people feared winter, hunger, disease, local wars. But today, human beings carry the anxiety of the entire world on their shoulders. We absorb hundreds of fears every single day, even though most of those things exist completely beyond our control. That is why so many modern people live in a constant state of silent tension. Even when nothing is personally wrong with their lives, because their minds are never truly allowed to rest. They are continuously dragged into breaking news, outrage, fear, and the feeling that the world is becoming more unstable every day. But perhaps the greatest danger is not the chaos outside. It is the fact that people are slowly losing the ability to think independently. Crowds today react faster than ever before. A headline appears, and millions instantly become angry. A crisis emerges, and the entire world panics together. Social media spreads emotion faster than truth itself. And in a world where everyone is reacting constantly, calmness begins to feel almost rebellious. This is something the Stoic philosophers understood thousands of years ago. You cannot stop the world from becoming chaotic, but you can stop your own mind from becoming chaotic with it. Marcus Aurelius lived during a period filled with war, plague, and instability inside the Roman Empire. He could not control the era he lived in, but he could control how he responded to it. That is why Stoicism still matters today. Not because it helps people escape reality, but because it helps people face reality without being destroyed by it. Perhaps real strength in the modern age no longer belongs to the people who possess the most information, because information is now everywhere. What has become rare is the ability to keep the mind calm enough to recognize what truly matters. In a world where everyone is distracted, focus becomes an advantage. In a world where everyone is panicking, calmness becomes power. And in a world where history itself seems to change every day, perhaps the most important thing is not predicting the future perfectly, but making sure you do not lose yourself while the world is changing around you. One of the strangest things about history is this. Most people only realize that an era has changed after they have already lost their place within it. When the internet first appeared, many believed it was only a temporary trend. When smartphones entered everyday life, few imagined they would completely transform the way people communicate, work, learn, and think. And today, many people are looking at artificial intelligence in exactly the same way. They see it as just another tool, just another technological innovation, just another trend that will eventually settle down. But history suggests otherwise. Every technology powerful enough eventually reshapes society itself. The people who recognize change early often become the leaders of the next era, while those who cling to the old world are often left behind by it. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Yet there is one problem. Human beings naturally resist change. The mind prefers familiarity. We are drawn to certainty. We want tomorrow to feel similar to today. That is why most people deny change, until it becomes impossible to deny. When systems begin to weaken, crowds usually move through three stages. First comes denial. People tell themselves everything will return to normal, that the disruption is temporary, that the old system will recover, that the future will look very much like the past. Then comes panic. As people begin realizing that something fundamental is changing, fear starts to spread. The familiar world no longer feels secure. Old assumptions begin to break apart. The future becomes difficult to predict, and uncertainty grows faster than confidence. Finally comes adaptation. But by then, many opportunities have already disappeared. History often rewards those who recognize change before the crowd does. Not because they are smarter than everyone else, but because they remain calm enough to observe. Crowds react emotionally. They become trapped in daily headlines. They focus on short-term events. They allow fear and uncertainty to shape their decisions. But people who can see the larger picture understand something important. Every major transition in history creates chaos before it creates a new order. That is why the most unstable periods often become the most transformative. The Industrial Revolutions changed civilization. The internet changed the way humanity communicates and thinks. And artificial intelligence may eventually transform our understanding of work, intelligence, creativity, and even human value itself. That possibility frightens many people. Not simply because of technology, but because deep down, they can feel that the world they once understood is slowly disappearing. And that feeling is not unique to our generation. Many generations before us experienced the same sensation when history entered a new chapter. But history teaches another lesson as well. The people who survive periods of chaos most successfully are not always the strongest, not always the richest, not always the most powerful. More often, they are the people who adapt best. That is why Stoicism never teaches us to control the world, because controlling the world is impossible. Instead, it teaches us to maintain stability within ourselves, while everything around us continues to change. Perhaps that is one of the most valuable skills of the modern age. Not predicting the future perfectly, not eliminating uncertainty, but keeping the mind clear enough to avoid being swept away by the chaos of the era. Perhaps that is why throughout every chaotic period in history, calm people have always stood out. Not because they knew exactly what would happen next, but because they understood one simple truth. The world is always changing. Empires rise and fall. Financial systems evolve. Technology constantly reshapes society. And history has never promised humanity permanent stability. Yet most people live as if stability is guaranteed forever. That is why whenever the world begins to shake, crowds immediately panic. They want everything to return to the way it used to be. They want markets to feel stable again. They want society to function the way it once did. They want the future to become predictable again. But perhaps that will never happen. Because humanity is entering an entirely new era. An era where artificial intelligence may redefine human labor. Automation may transform millions of jobs. Data has become a new form of power. And technology is evolving faster than society can adapt. This is no longer just a technological shift. It is a transformation in the way civilization itself operates. And during periods like these, the most important thing is not who reacts the fastest. It is who remains clear-minded the longest. Crowds always react emotionally. When markets rise, they become greedy. When markets fall, they become fearful. When negative headlines appear, they instantly believe everything is collapsing. But history shows something important. The emotions of crowds change far faster than reality itself. That is why wise people often spend more time observing than reacting. They understand that every era contains chaos. Every era contains uncertainty. And every generation once believed it was living near the end of history. Yet the world continued moving forward. Human beings love believing their era is uniquely catastrophic. But if we look across history, we begin to see that wars, crises, the collapse of old systems, and the rise of new orders have always been part of human civilization. The only real difference now is speed. Everything is happening faster than ever before. Information spreads faster. Crises spread faster. Technology evolves faster. And the emotions of crowds are amplified instantly through the internet. That is why maintaining a calm mind today is far more difficult than it once was. Because the modern world constantly pulls people into reaction. There is always something new to fear. Always another controversy. Always another crisis appearing on a screen. And without realizing it, people can spend their entire lives reacting to the noise of the world, without ever understanding what truly matters. Perhaps that is why Stoicism still remains valuable after thousands of years. Not because it makes life easier, but because it reminds human beings of something essential. In a world that never stops changing, real stability must be built from within. Perhaps what makes this era so unique is not simply that the world is changing, but that for the first time in modern history, human beings are beginning to feel unable to keep up with the civilization they created themselves. Everything is accelerating. Artificial intelligence is advancing faster than predicted. Technology is evolving faster than education systems can adapt. Information spreads faster than human beings can process it. And while the world races forward at unprecedented speed, millions of people are beginning to feel left behind. That is why so many people today live with a strange feeling they cannot fully explain. A feeling that everything is changing too quickly. The future feels increasingly uncertain. And the things that once created stability are slowly disappearing. Jobs that once felt secure may now disappear within years. Skills that once carried value can suddenly become outdated. Even the way human beings communicate, love, and think is being reshaped by technology every single day. That is why many people feel they are living in a world that is both familiar and completely unfamiliar at the same time. And when people no longer feel certain about the future, they begin searching for something to hold onto. Some cling to money. Some cling to technology. Some cling to promises that everything will eventually return to normal. But history shows something important. After major transitions, the world rarely returns to what it once was. Every major crisis in history permanently transformed civilization. After wars, the world changed. After the industrial revolutions, society changed. After the internet, human behavior changed. And perhaps after artificial intelligence, everything will change once again. But in the middle of all these transformations, one thing has remained unchanged for thousands of years. Human nature itself. Human beings still fear uncertainty, still worry about the future, still search for stability in the middle of chaos. That is why ancient philosophies still remain relevant today. Because no matter how quickly technology evolves, the human mind still struggles with the same fears. The fear of losing control. The fear of being left behind. The fear that the world is becoming too unfamiliar. And perhaps that is why Stoicism never truly disappeared. During stable periods, people often forget the value of calmness. But once the world begins to shake, human beings start searching again for something capable of keeping the mind steady. Not because Stoicism removes hardship, but because it helps people move through hardship without losing themselves. Perhaps that is what truly matters most in the modern age. Not who predicts the future most accurately, not who reacts the fastest, but who can preserve clarity of thought while the world becomes more chaotic every day. Because in the end, every chaotic era eventually passes. But the people who lose themselves inside the chaos often never fully return the same way again. Perhaps the saddest part of the modern age is that many people spend their entire lives reacting to the world, without ever truly understanding how the world is changing. They wake up every morning and are immediately pulled into noise. A new crisis, a new controversy, a new fear, a new headline demanding attention. Everything is designed to capture the human mind. And over time, many people begin living in a permanently distracted state. They no longer truly think. They simply react. That is why the internet has made humanity feel more connected than ever before, while simultaneously making people easier to manipulate than ever before. Because a mind without silence is easily controlled by the emotions of the crowd. Today, many people no longer know what truly matters. They are pulled from one fear to another. Today it is war. Tomorrow it is artificial intelligence. The next day it is economic collapse. And while they remain trapped inside an endless cycle of panic, time continues moving forward. That is the most dangerous part. Not that the world is changing, but that human beings are losing their lives, while constantly reacting to those changes. The Stoic philosophers understood this deeply. They knew that the world would always remain unstable. Human beings would always fear uncertainty. And history would always change beyond prediction. But they also understood something else. A calm mind sees more clearly than a fearful one. That is why during every chaotic period in history, the most powerful people were not always the strongest. Often, they were simply the ones who remained clear-minded while everyone around them lost control. Because when crowds are driven by emotion, they become slaves to fear. They chase short-term distractions. They react to every small fluctuation. They live in constant psychological tension without even realizing it. And then years pass, and they look back on their lives only to realize they spent too much time worrying about things that never even happened. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of modern humanity. Not the lack of information, but being buried beneath too much of it. Not the absence of opportunity, but minds too overwhelmed to recognize it. That is why calmness has become such a rare advantage today. A person capable of thinking clearly in the middle of chaos will notice things the crowd never sees. They are not controlled by every headline. They do not react to every controversy. They do not allow fear to dictate their entire lives. They understand that history always changes, systems always evolve, and the future will always remain uncertain. But that does not mean human beings must live in panic. Perhaps real power in this century does not come from controlling the world, but from keeping your own mind from being controlled by it. Perhaps in the end, the most important question is not what the world will become, but who you will become while the world is changing. History will continue moving forward whether humanity is ready or not. Systems will continue evolving. Technology will continue advancing. New crises will continue appearing. And old orders will eventually fade away. That has happened throughout thousands of years of human history. And perhaps it is happening once again right now. But if we look back at every civilization that has ever risen and fallen, we begin to notice something fascinating. The people who survive chaotic eras most successfully are not always the strongest, not always the richest, not always the most powerful, and not even the least fearful. More often, they are the people who remain clear-minded while the world around them loses direction. Because during periods of rapid historical change, crowds almost always react with panic. They are pulled from one fear to another, controlled by daily headlines, consumed by endless arguments and emotional noise. And eventually, many spend their entire lives reacting to the world, without ever truly living. Perhaps that is what Stoicism has always tried to remind humanity. You cannot control the era you were born into. You cannot control history. You cannot control technology. You cannot control the future of civilization. But you can always control how you face those things. You can choose to panic with the crowd, or to keep your mind calm enough to recognize what truly matters. Because in the end, every crisis eventually passes. Every empire eventually changes. Every era eventually ends so another one can begin. But a mind that loses itself inside chaos often struggles to find peace again. Perhaps that is why in an increasingly noisy world, silence becomes strength. In an increasingly chaotic world, clarity becomes an advantage. And in a world where almost everyone is trapped inside emotional reaction, the ability to maintain a calm mind may become one of the most important skills of this century. Because the future has never belonged to the most panicked people. It has always belonged to the people who could see clearly. If you enjoy videos about Stoicism, psychology, history, and the great transformations shaping modern civilization, subscribe to Stoic Scrolls and join us for future videos. And remember, the world will continue changing. The real question is whether you will lose yourself while it does.